Good morning, everyone. This is episode 5 of the Around the Bend podcast, and I have Jeff Stewart here, the former current COO of SVB. Good morning, Jeff.
Blake.
Perfect. Yeah, no, I wanted to thank you for kind of taking the time out to talk, and especially at this point in history. I mean, what are we at? We're at March 20th. 2023. I think in a couple months we might look back and forget this moment, but right now over the weekend, SVB just filed Chapter 11. I mean, they've had, sort of a little bit of an implosion along with some other banks here in the U.S. Not to be negative, just given this little kind of timestamp so that sometimes when people come back and watch these videos, they understand the context in which we're talking, and maybe some of our responses may not make sense a couple months from now.
Gotcha. No, I completely agree. There's been a lot of activity over the last couple of weeks alone, so I'm sure it's not going to end here.
Yeah. If you want to delve a little bit into your background and just kind of tell the audience sort of
Sure.
a little bit about yourself.
Thank you for bringing me here. So I've been in financial institutions for almost 30 years now, primarily sitting between the business and technology and the finance side of the equation, which has always been an interesting place to be. From 30 years, we've advanced from mainframes to very advanced technologies and platforms and foundational systems. I did go through the downfall in 2008 for Wachovia whenever Wells Fargo came into the mix, and that was an interesting set of dynamics. And now, having gone 15 years later through the Silicon Valley Bank opportunities, it's been interesting to watch what occurs and, like you said, try to figure out some of the underlying facts of why what happened, but not hold that over anybody's head, but hopefully learn and grow and advance to the next levels in the future.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I feel like this is a very different, SVB is going to be its own unique sort of example, maybe in all of financial history, because if you go back to 2008 and many other kind of like previous banking collapses, a lot of it is driven by like excessive greed, things of that nature. If you go back to 2008 and they interviewed a lot of these executives, like all the people that were putting in the controls were kind of being ridiculed. They said, we make money at any cost. But at SVB, I've talked to a bunch of people in the C-level and the senior manager space, and it's like, well, our goal was growing. We were all super busy. And then all of a sudden we went out of business. There was not a malicious undertone, sort of, if you've gone back and watched some of those interviews from the whole 2008 debacle.
Absolutely. And if I even go back to when I started Silicon Valley Bank, it was a relatively small company in relation to where it was in the last few weeks from a growth perspective. And the growth did occur really quickly. And honestly, that's one of the outliers for what drove to where we're at this point, because from a regulatory standpoint, preparation had to be super quick, because when you grow that fast and you're dealing with regulators and other bodies that are watching what's going on inside the walls of a company, you know that, especially from a financial institution standpoint, you have to comply pretty quickly and provide what's needed to show that you're in a sound financial place with your company. And so we had a lot of regulatory reporting requirements we had to meet, as well as other requirements that were coming down the pipe from a risk standpoint and other factors that we had to look at. And the growth was immense and quick. And having been on, and one thing I did say earlier, having been on the East Coast and being one of the first LFI team members to join from a Charlotte financial institution, it was interesting to come in and start to see what was behind the walls of Silicon Valley Bank, which was vastly different than other banks I've been a part of, because they're there for venture capital, startups, and many other activities that aren't really inherent in some of the other banks. So long story short, we grew Charlotte fairly quickly to about 200 people in the total footprint of employees. But, as we were trying to advance to the right levels, it was just a very fast path to get there, which I think we were accomplishing most of. But just in, like you said, recent weeks, we've seen a lot of activities really start to advance quickly to a level that we probably did not anticipate.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's good to just, we'll kind of track off into other subjects, but I think it's important for listeners to understand the transition that Silicon Valley Bank made in terms of overall asset size and growth would have been it could have been for some of these banks like JP Morgan Chase and Wells Fargo and even like Bank of America, those transitions took decades, and Silicon Valley Bank did it in 1 year.
Very true. Our transition went from about 50 billion to 250 billion in a little over 1 year, which is massive growth, which puts you at different levels under the observation of regulators and other areas outside of the firm. So, as we saw the growth go from 50 to 250, I won't say overnight, but it felt that way. The reality is it was a lot of customers that were also coming to the table that SVB had a part in putting together. DoorDash and other large companies were coming and needing a place to deposit cash. And so you were seeing the assets grow really rapidly from that standpoint. So that was all a great path to be tracking down because obviously the growth was imminent. It was the slowdown in the economy that started to bring more of a factor in that you had to really be prepared for. And so, as we've heard about withdrawals from the company and other factors that came into play, that was a different side of the equation, obviously, for the folks that are all still there in the current firm. But no, the growth was immense quickly, and that was a very positive thing. But you think back to your point, the company was over almost 50 years old. The growth was very slow up until just the last 2 years of their existence. And so that, to your point, could have been decades for large financial institutions. It was literally a blip on the map for them in the overall lifespan of Silicon Valley Bank.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of creates, especially kind of on the IT side of thing and the regulatory perspective, I heard from some people, even one of my family friends, used to be at SVB, you would have to make a weekly report to regulators before they hit the $150 billion threshold. Then once you cross that, and I believe you referred to it as LFI.
Large financial institution. Yes.
Okay. Bingo. Yeah, because I'm not good with all the finance lingo. Once you cross that, you actually have to do daily reports. So a lot of your effort that just 1 week before, because that's how fast this growth kind of took itself on, 1 week before, all the processes, all the day-to-day was set up for 4 reports a week. And then you transition into 20 reports a week overnight, or 20 reports a month. So apologies.
True.
Overnight.
And it's not just that they had to be advanced more quickly. They had to be morphed into other reports. And so from a regulatory standpoint, the requirements as you continue up the path of large financial institution status, the regulators require different insight into your company to show exactly how sound your financials are, as well as your risk monitoring and management, all of those factors. And so the interesting fact is you actually have a window to provide that reporting. It's not an overnight mandatory thing that you have immediately come up with. And I'll just pick on FRY 14s, M's for monthly, Q's for quarterly, A's for annual. You have a window to get those created, but they're not small reports by any stretch. Those are new reports that you have to go to your underlying foundational financial information and start to pull that together to produce that in the fashion. But to your point, you're right. There are some that become more repetitious, almost daily, where you need to show visually what has happened within your company on any given day from an asset risk and other standpoints, so that the regulators feel comfortable that you can truly provide what they're looking for and the assurance that you're in a good financial standing on every given day.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that sounds like, were you there kind of from the pre-LFI, post-LFI moment?
So actually, when I came in, I was brought in to lead transformation within finance, which was interesting. Because it really was operations, execution, and transformation. Because the reality is, while we would love to take taking the organization to a completely different level from a foundational standpoint for financial systems and other factors, we had a lot of mandatory requirements we had to meet. And so I was actually leading the program management arm inside of finance, which was leading regulatory reporting, expediting the financial close process, as well as other factors that were driving us really to deliver and execute what was mandatory. And then there were other factors like strategy and innovation, which also wove itself in. But our focus really had to be on what were the most critical mandatory things that we had to deliver when I first entered in. But I did watch the evolution so quick occur that we had to be very open-minded to how we were going to deal with those particular activities and how we wove them in, to your point, from a technology delivery standpoint for certain data aspects, from a business standpoint to be able to tie that together from a reporting standpoint. And so there was a lot of where I have always sat, a lot of mix in the middle where you bring all of that together to ensure you have a total package that accommodates what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. And I would say, just because a lot of my listeners, and I work in the IT space with a lot of different companies, engineering, kind of supplying their IT engineering needs, was the difficulty of maintaining that IT infrastructure, did it just kind of, what would I call it? Did it just kind of go straight up like a steep hill, or was it kind of the same needs or a step more difficult when you kind of cross that threshold?
So realistically, from the standpoint of Silicon Valley Bank, it wasn't a technology pullback that was the driver for not being able to meet what was required. We were truly meeting what needed to be required. A lot of it goes back now foundationally to data. And that's why you see a lot of chief data officers and data teams being put together, because the systems can provide what's needed, but is there a solid understanding of all of the different data components that are required to bring it together? And even if you understand the components required to bring it together, can you dive deeper into the foundation of your data and understand all of the components that are required to add together to come up with what that answer is? And so, foundationally, if a company truly had data at a certain level, it would be a lot easier. But you find a lot of them are various components across different lines of business, and all of that has to be consumed, added, subtracted, and accommodated to bring together to come up with a final number when you're trying to meet some of these regulatory requirements. So a lot of the downfall is not the technology, or I don't say downfall, but a lot of the holdbacks, not the technology, but it truly is going in and understanding all the data components, because the data necessity is changing rapidly within every organization these days, as data is a mandatory understanding everyone needs to have to really show that you truly can answer questions and accommodate what regulators and other bodies are looking for.
Previous to SVB, like in your own experience, did you feel maybe LFIs, large financial institutions, had a better insight into the kinds of data you're talking about, especially taking the financial technology and kind of extrapolating insights off of it? Because maybe this is just a thought I had, that maybe with SVB being so busy, so much growth, you're so concentrated on your day-to-day that long-term, those strategic initiatives fall to the wayside at points.
At the other large financial institutions, they're not dissimilar from where Silicon Valley finds itself. They've all grown rapidly, and they all have so many different departments that still, at the end of the day, having sat in the finance footprint of a lot of large financial institutions, the systems can accommodate. Hasn't necessarily been a complete data understanding in each of those as well. And so each of those organizations have put data officers in place, as well as complete data teams, because, as we've continued from 2008 to today, the regulatory bodies have wanted to see more visibility into you understanding the data inside of your systems. The large financial institutions started earlier, let's say, than Silicon Valley Bank. But having a lot of friends that are chief data officers, I know that there's still a lot of ground to cover in every organization these days. Not to say they haven't made a lot of progress, but it is a very long journey. It's not an overnight flick the switch type opportunity. There's a lot of chance for folks to go in and continue to drive into the data and bring more consistency to the data. And then you brought up a point around technology. As you're looking at it, as you're bringing your systems together, you then are looking at bringing more consistency to your data so that you can land on one system and maybe replace several systems in the mix, depending on the organization or the part of the corporation that you're actually looking at. So I think there's lots of opportunities for improvement there, no matter how we look at it, regardless of the size and scale of the company.
So kind of delving into that a little bit more, if we're saying I don't know, what kind of are the main technologies you see needing to be developed over the next, like, let's say 3 to 5 years, just in the financial industry as a whole, not just SVB, not just LFIs. What do you see those big changes coming down the road
And I'll
being
just
then?
use the term data warehouse because that seems to be pretty consistent across all the platforms. People call it different things, but what we're seeing is the need to bring all data into one housing location so that you don't have different occurrences of data across different platforms in different parts of the organization. The best thing to do is to bring it into one platform and let that be the single source of truth for all data. And I think that is something that we're striving
Mm,
for. But over the, like you said, the next 3 to 5 years, that's a path that we have to accelerate and achieve fairly quickly because that's going to bring the ability for all the systems to zone in on one source of data versus A system going and get it from here, but B system goes for the same piece of data, but they find it in another database. And so I've seen that historically be the case, but I have
mhm.
seen a real strong drive to bring those singular data warehouses into the equation and be the housing point for everything.
No, that's actually a really good point. Just so maybe some of the people that don't understand the infrastructure piece as much, basically, most companies, wherever they get their data from, whether it's from like customers doing transactions on the website or social media or, even internal reports, nowadays there's so much data that we can tap into with technology that some companies, they'll put them into like a warehouse or multiple what they call data lakes, which are essentially big pools of unstructured data. And then you have to translate that data with different programs and things of that nature. They call it putting it through like a data pipeline. And then you'll hopefully get some actionable insight at the end of that. And that way, if some people are like, what's a data lake? What's a data warehouse? What are you talking about?
No, and I agree with you,
You
Blake.
know?
I think when you look at it, like I said, everybody's going to have a little bit different name for it, but ultimately it's one housing point for data. However we want to name it, it's having the data in a very understandable format where it's easily accessible, but it's a singular instance of it. That really becomes the main driver of all of this.
Mm, absolutely.
You got
Give me
it.
1 second. It's either getting too dark or too bright. The sun's coming up
No
right in my
worries.
eyes. But I think that is an interesting point. So would you argue that companies have too many data lakes essentially that are not really they're not, when they're drawing those actionable insights, they're not really drawing them together, they're drawing them separately?
I don't know that I would say they're drawn separately, but I think the level of effort it takes to consolidate the data becomes so horrific for teams because you
Hmm.
have multiple teams that ultimately provide the right information, but they have to go to so many sources to pull it together. I think what it's going to bring is, I don't know that it'll bring a differentiation in the data, but it's going to bring a much simpler format and approach to gathering the data as opposed to where we find ourselves today. Because it may take a team 2 or 3 days to compile a full set of data for an executive, whereas if you had a singular source of that data sitting in a lake or warehouse or whatever we call it, you could simply go run one report within a matter of hopefully minutes or an hour and then provide that versus days of multiple teams pulling it together. So I think that's going to be more of the comfort and efficiency that we gain from it, but also the consistency and the reliability. That's really what I think is a much stronger factor there.
I see. And this is more of a geeking out question, but I don't know if you were working with any of the data teams or data scientists. Like what processing tools do they use in the financial
I will
space?
be honest, sitting in the operations side of the equation, I've never delved that deep into it. I've ran some SQL historically, and
Okay.
I've been engaged in some activities, but I know there are a lot of, complex tools that are allowing a much faster method of getting to where we're talking about getting to, but I've not been in the throes of that. I guess I can look at that as a positive or a negative.
Honestly, it probably is more of a positive because everybody tells me there's only a couple big tools that people use right now. Like, and you get frustrated, just probably like you did with SQL. Yeah, and people that don't know, SQL is like a
Yeah.
database language that even I know a little bit, and I am not a computer scientist. You just like punch in a command and it'll draw something out of the database for you, kind of thing. And I think it's sort of what is it? your experience is kind of unique because you've sat in so many different seats. You've been in the large financial institution, you've been in SVB, you've been in kind of this operations space for so long, and especially to your background with Wachovia. What do you think's a unique? What are your takeaways? Because you've been in two big, like, I don't know if I call them bubble busts or, just two large kind of banks that went down. What are your takeaways?
Well, let me go back just for a second, because you brought up an interesting, I didn't really go into my career, and I'm not going to delve into it too deep, but when I left college a number of decades ago, I went in initially to a technology coding and development job, which was COBOL coding on the mainframe back in the day, as well as writing SQL, the standard query language. And probably wasn't as good as I could be at that. So they moved me more over to the business side of the equation, but at least I was moving in the right direction. After about 5 years is when I had an opportunity to either go into HR or finance. And I chose to go become the operations head of the finance side of the equation for First Union at that point in time. Now, what that taught me through my career is I did have a technology beginning, so I understood basically the foundation of technology, but also had a good understanding of the business. And so what you'll find in these large companies is you have to have a good understanding of both of those sides of the equation, because you really become the translator between the business and technology. Otherwise, there seems to always be, or most of the time, there's a disconnect, because the business wants ABC, technology here's XYZ, what's delivered doesn't match up what was needed, there's business updates that are needed, and so it becomes a cycle. But when you have an operations team in the middle, which hopefully is people that bring both the business and technology part of the equation together, then they can help translate and make sure that what's needed is what's delivered, and then stay on top of that throughout the lifespan of whatever you're connecting with. Now, you brought up a good point of, what do I see, or what occurred from the two places I've been where I've seen interesting occurrences within the organizations. So one interesting fact, on the day that Wachovia went under, I was actually at an Oracle conference. I'd done an Oracle implementation for Wachovia and went to a conference. I was on a plane coming home from San Francisco to Charlotte. The stock was $7.50 a share. Back in that day, we didn't have cell phones or anything. And or at least I didn't have one. When I landed, it was 75 cents a share. So I was a little surprised that day. We had a few days to process that. Of course, we got into a situation where Citi was considering procurement of Wachovia, and Wells Fargo came into the mix. And so it was an interesting slide over into the Wells Fargo framework, which was vastly different than Wachovia. We learned a lot. We grew. We became a very large financial institution overnight when that occurred, obviously. But at First Union, I had handled more than 100 mergers as we went through the procurement of a lot of different firms in the First Union footprint. And where I was sitting in finance, I was a part of 100 mergers there. So it was a very good learning opportunity to understand, how do you bring people in, how do you accommodate for their financials, and how do you report almost immediately, because it wasn't a very long-term cycle for those. So it was a good opportunity to do that and help out Wells Fargo. Realistically, what occurred? It was a series of activities back in 2008 that were causing the downfall of a lot of financial institutions. Some of them were more able to survive than others, and we know the history of a lot of them that probably became counterparts of other large financial institutions that procured them. Merrill Lynch became part of Bank of America, and others became part of other organizations. But if you fast forward to Silicon Valley Bank, so let me drop back for 1 second. I did go to Lowe's Home Improvement for 2 years. So I did delve into retail for 2 years. I managed their financial footprint from an operations standpoint, and led the execution and delivery of PeopleSoft upgrades there. Realized that I'm not opposed to retail, but it wasn't really my sweet spot. And so I ended up at Bank of America to work on their SAP implementation. That was their selection for financial platform. Went there, we accommodated that, and then I ran the financial operations at Bank of America for about 9 years. When Silicon Valley Bank called for the first time, it was a very interesting conversation. They were very energetic. It was very eye-opening. They actually had a strong light behind them, I will say. They were very optimistic, and they were very encouraging. And so it was a good conversation. And when I went into that part of the equation, we've already talked about what I did there. With the economy going where it was interesting. But to see the downfall of it, the preparation for it seemed to be not in place at all for what ultimately happened to the organization.
Mm.
And with 8,500 people still there, it's a scary place right now. But in this economy, like you and I are talking today, there are more layoffs almost daily right now, which is an interesting place to be because you've heard of hirings at a very high level for the past couple of years, and now you see major layoffs occurring. And so we're having to accommodate, help a lot of friends find places to land and places to go and be successful. So, and I'll delve in any deeper. Feel free to ask a little deeper there, whatever we can jump into.
Yeah, and that's actually one of the reasons I actually started this podcast in the beginning, watching all these layoffs, kind of being in the recruiting space where I sort of have a book of business. I try and, of course, get new clients, and people always come to me. They're like, hey, especially with these layoffs, I'm looking for something. Can you help me out? And it was just frustrating because I'm like, I do have roles, but they're not, exact congruent to what's good for your skill set, especially people that have really interesting backgrounds like yourself. It's like, it's going to take a while to find the right position. You have a very unique skill set, and it's better to take that time to find what's right for you. And the interview process, I just hate it in general because I don't feel like you're really showing off what people's real skills are. I've had many people, friends, and, some of our candidates that they interview terribly, but if you just sat them down and just had them talk, you'd be like, oh my gosh, this person is extremely intelligent, extremely capable. And that's sort of where this idea came from, is like, if you really understand what people are actually doing or some of their experiences, because in an interview, I had one guy, he was just not a very talkative guy, but then I got him on this podcast. I had him talk. It was episode 3, and he's like talking about how he's writing software code for F-16s and all these things, working for private companies. I'm like, that's amazing. And like just the breakdown of that and just giving someone the time to talk about what their passion and their knowledge base is, I think really unlocks things. Because you mentioned earlier being a business translator. In my role, that's kind of what I do. Like, people think that recruiting, if you're a crappy recruiter, just like any other kind of client-facing role, you'll be transactional. You're not really there to help people. So I have a lot of HR HR from different companies. They're like, I need this skill set and this person, this experience. I'm like, why don't we talk with the hiring manager? Because no offense, you actually don't really understand this technology, and you telling me what you think we need probably won't get us to where we need to go. And if even the culture, the emotional aspect of business, like if I bring one kind of person with one kind of mindset, I don't know if it's going to work well on your team, if I'm being honest. Those little nuances that on paper maybe make sense, but in the actual application or operations of day-to-day business just don't work unless you have that kind of, you have a sixth sense for some of these operational kind of difficulties and things like that. And that's why I kind of went off on a rant.
So
but
historically, I've always jumped into university hiring and other factors. And part of me questions why I didn't go to the HR side of the equation when I said that was offered 25 years ago, because I do love the people side of the equation. But you bring up a good point. For me, I don't try to hire the skill set necessarily. I look at all the factors. I look at the personality. I look at the accomplishments. And if I have a history with a particular individual, I look at their progress through their career, because it may be that a person doesn't have the exact skill set I'm looking for, but that can be learned in a few weeks. But I'm looking for somebody to bring the foundation that brings the expertise, the professionalism, and all the other factors that are needed, executive presentation skills, and all the things that we hear in all the interviews that we sit in these days. But I look for people that bring the foundational skills, because if it's one factor and it's not too complex, I know they can learn it. And so even when I was at Silicon Valley Bank and I was the third hire, when I say we went to 200, I was engaged in a lot of the hiring process. I'm not going to lie, I strategically went back and looked at talent that I knew brought diversity into the equation from all factors, not just one skill set where I thought they could come in and add value. Because at a company that's only 8,500 people now, but it was only about 6,500 when I joined, you can't just go hire a bevy of people. You needed to bring in people that were very broad and could accomplish a number of different activities, as opposed to someone who singularly came in and only looked at this, and then the next person looked at this, and so what could not work in that fashion, and I knew that, and so that's why, you talk about the level of talent that's out there right now that's back in the job market. Just from an SVB standpoint, a lot of that talent is very broad and diverse with very deep understandings of the different places they're lying right now. And even in Charlotte, a lot of the focus was finance, it was risk, and HR. And so those were three of the critical areas that got tremendous value and where we lost some talent recently.
And I would actually give a little bit of a hopeful note that, is it harder than it was a year ago to find a position or, a new career? Yes, it is. But at the same time, in the technology space, HR, anyone with a deep, kind of breadth of experience, the way the market's looking based on Robert Half's own internal kind of projections, things of that nature, is that we're gonna, with the Fed, the banks, all these things, we don't know 100% what's going to happen, but the underlying hiring, the underlying growth is still there. So until we are actually in a recession, we're seeing people get laid off from Meta and Netflix and all these big name brand companies. And then those people are turning around in 1 to 2 months, a normal kind of interview hiring cycle. They're getting positions at maybe companies that are just less well known. Like my friend, he was an engineer at Google, he left on his own accord, family reasons, things like that. He was out in the market and he's like, oh, I'm stressing out. I'm like, you don't need to stress out. And then bam, you got a role at Genentech. But when I say Genentech, nobody knows what Genentech is, but it's still a really large, massive company, so there's still a lot of opportunities, because I have a lot of LinkedIn kind of notifications for certain roles that I help companies with. And it's like every day I see 30 new program managers, 30 new full stack engineers. So I would say it's going to be a little bit harder than you were used to during COVID, but COVID was an very unnatural hiring time. Right. In the industry as a whole.
When I think about it, you're right. What I'm telling my friends is people are losing opportunities, but I've been looking at LinkedIn and other opportunities. There's lots of roles out there. It may not be perfect, or it might be a different industry. And so I've even been very open-minded when I say I've been in financial institutions my whole career, I'm more open-minded than that now at this phase of my life and career, where I'm actually openly looking outside of financial institutions at insurance companies and other types of firms that have high needs right now for growth and development. And they're trying to find critical talent to fill some of those roles. And so it's been a lot of interesting conversations for myself personally, now that I've been on the market for about 6 weeks. But I'm not rushing into anything. I'm being very open-minded about really, I guess I'm looking at it, where do I want to spend the next phase of my career? Because I don't just want to jump on something because money's there. I want to make sure that it's something where I can go in and add value, lead critical team members, provide tremendous value, and bring success to the company. If I can do that, then I'm going to feel good at the end of the day. It's not about going in there for one factor that supports me. It's about going in there and supporting the factors of the organization. The other things come to pass. That's not even an issue, but it's really going in and making a difference. And so that's what I'm looking for right now.
And I think that's really important, because I've seen a lot of people that, I get it. It's stressful. You've been laid off, or if, let's say you're in between roles and you're like, oh, that stress starts to build up. Oh, will I be able to pay my bills? Will I be able to do this? Don't just jump into a role to jump into a role, especially like in the technology space, people with, kind of unique skill sets like yourself. It's better to take that time and to make that transition. And this is just sort of a pro tip or something I see, especially in the C-level, director, VP level spaces. It's better to just take the time and make one good selection than to have the jumps on your resume at the higher level, because it's at your kind of roles, it takes a while to, like, let's say, calibrate yourself to an organization, just like any other role. And then to deliver those kind of changes that you're kind of talking about they take time. And I have a friend right now, he was the director of AI at Levi Strauss. And he's just taking his time, because there's many off roles he's been offered, but it's like, you should get the one that you're looking for. If, of course, if you have financial things, other stuff, families, okay, that I understand. but in the grand scheme of things, try and find that balance, because I've been offered multiple roles working here at Robert Half, but the overall kind of satisfaction I get out of my job, the way I can help clients and even candidates, I think for me, that's the fun part, is like helping out the people, and just trying to get them to that next stage in their career. There's other firms that, yeah, maybe they offer a little bit higher base salary or a better perk or free lunches or whatever it is. But if you're not getting that satisfaction out of your work,
right,
there's not much of a point
I would
to
agree.
it.
And, as I look at what I want to be when I grow up, which is my joke with my family right now, they would debate that. Obviously, I want to go a place again where I potentially know people, but if I don't, we'll grow relationships fairly quickly. You're looking for outstanding support from executive leadership because they understand foundationally what they want to accomplish. And then you basically come in and start to take those tasks and organize against those and deliver and execute against those. And if all of that can be accomplished, that's almost perfection. I'm not fooling myself into thinking that will absolutely occur, but there are some major factors there that I'm not willing to not accommodate as I move into this. So, the executive support and the strong teams are critical aspects of this. But then to your point, something you love doing, something you enjoy doing. And so I'm agreeing with you on that I'm hoping everyone is looking holistically at what they're searching for out there. Not to say folks do not need to land somewhere and help themselves immediately financially in other ways. I get that, and more than willing to help support anyone that I can along the way as well. But I definitely want folks to feel good at what they do and feel like they add value and see the potential for advancement in their career. That's another big factor that has disappeared in a lot of places historically, where it's like almost when you land in a spot, the advancement opportunities sometimes don't become available to you because of external hiring and other factors that come into play. Because it's like if you go in at a certain level, that's where you sit, and nobody wants to sit there for decades. So anyway, and not exactly what we came to talk about today, but I'm there with you because I've been supporting HR components for decades as well. Not as fundamentally as finance, but I do love the HR side of the equation.
One thing that's interesting about your background, you have the financial part, you have the operations piece, and the technology piece. So, I mean, there's, what is it? One guy I know, actually the same AI guy, is like, builders are going to build. So when you have that skill set and kind of, just people can see here, you have a very open personality and things like that. You have a skill set, you could easily walk into many different roles and probably execute on, really big strategic initiatives and things of that nature. And maybe just, here's a more general question, that kind of will highlight your thought processes, is like, when we were talking about the strategic initiatives earlier, like in some of your earlier roles, how did you balance, like, let's say, the financial oversight and maybe your day-to-day muck that you have to go through? And then how do you balance that with those long-term strategic objectives, especially in the technology side of things?
So, the interesting thing, and I'm sure a lot of people have experienced this, I've been through a lot of interviews, I'm not going to lie. One of the inherent questions, people probably know this, is how do you deal with issues? What did you do when an issue occurred? And so, something you bring up there, how do you manage the financials? You, again, need the visibility to every aspect of what's occurring. You've got the technology components, you have external players usually in the mix, you have the technology or software that was purchased, and then you have to potentially buy hardware, or you're working in a cloud environment. And so you're realistically, like you said, and then you've got internal people that are working on it. So you look at true dollars as well as not really true dollars that come into play, but accounting for all of that accurately. So on any project team, you do need accurate accounting components that can come in and help you account for that and deal with that and display that in a visible fashion that makes sense. Now, ultimately, you need to have goals in place, and you don't want to overachieve those goals from a financial standpoint. Coming in under is always a big bonus. But one of the biggest things that happens is issue management. In any particular large-scale program I've been in, historically, a lot of people want to guard issues and try to fix them without alerting executives that they exist. For me, if an issue exists, I'm going to sit at the table with an executive, explain what it is, but I'm not just going to tell them what it is. We're going to have a few corrective measures we can take to take it out of the mix. But I don't want an executive to ever sit there and think, oh, wow, they're knocking it out of the park. There's no project you're going to work on at the scale and level I've worked on historically that's not going to bring issues forward that need executive input into the process. But a lot of times that has been guarded. And so I don't guard it. I take it forward. We have open dialogue with executives. We get their feedback. We go deal with technology or external vendors or the provider of the software or other services and make sure that we have a solid foundation of how we're going to make corrections and move things forward. Because the other factor that comes into play is the timeline. If you look at it, the people, the price, and the timeline are the three factors for every program. And any of those have a little bit of variability, but you don't have a lot built into it. And so realistically, what happens is the number of issues can drive the timeline longer. I see where the issues are that come into that, but at a certain point, you have to be realistic as well. Because I will say this, in most programs I've been engaged in, the dollars are less than what's initially wanted to be spent. The teams are relatively smaller going into it than what you initially want to set up, and the timeline is always shorter than what can truly be accomplished. And if we truly painted the right picture on the wall, we would see that we need a few more people, we need a few more dollars, and we probably need a few more months to truly accomplish what is ultimately going to happen anyway. But it always looks good whenever you paint the first picture, and it looks a whole lot better. So not bashing what anyone's done at all, but it is a byproduct that I've been a part of for a long time and learned a lot along the way. And I'm much more open-minded and open about what's occurring so that everybody has the visibility they need so that no one's sitting there surprised by things. That's the biggest thing I never want to do to an executive is surprise them. I want them to always feel like they have good visibility into everything that's occurring.
I mean, that all you're saying shows that you've kind of been in that seat before, because actually in the last episode, Joe Bresler, he was the part of the PMO at Oracle, and just kind of, doing projects with hundreds of people attached to him. He's like, it never goes the way you're expecting it to go, but as long as you effectively get to your goal, that's what's important, because they kind of take on a life of their own, and, everything changes in the middle. Even my roommate, he works at Amazon, and they try and pull okay, you have 4 months for this project, 2 months in, they're like, well, we got to finish this in 1 month. So they try and chop off 25% of your time and watch you run around with a chicken with your head cut off kind of thing.
And then you throw in, and not to get too deep into these aspects, but it used to be waterfall projects and now it's agile. And agile is just a faster iteration of waterfall in much smaller increments. And hopefully you can see the good progress that's being made by agile actually accomplishing what it intends to in smaller week increments. But in reality, it can, if you have the right team members and the right components and the right level of questions being asked and the right level of things you're tackling, it is a very good framework to utilize. But if you truly don't have a good agile team in place to accomplish all of those aspects and prioritize, then you still find yourself in a little bit of limbo along the way as well. So not bashing any of that, but it definitely is something that if you're going to move from waterfall to agile or go back to waterfall, doesn't matter. You still need a good foundation of financials, people, and timeline, as well as external players and other factors in the mix.
No, absolutely. It's actually funny you mentioned waterfall. I mentioned that to some younger programmers the other day, and they're like, how do they understood generally how it works, but they're like, why would I use that? Like, so it is definitely someone with your breadth of experience in the operations space. You got a lot of different tools in your tool belt, so to speak.
You make a good point. Waterfall, I would never go back to a full waterfall. Is it agile or is it a hybrid between the two? And now I find that in a lot of places I've been pulled into, hybrid is kind of the mix. So to your point, you have an overall vision of what the ultimate delivery is going to be. But I'm not going to wait 3 years to see if you successfully got there. I do want to see incremental delivery of components, but it may or may not have to be 2-week increments. It may be more monthly or bi-monthly or whatever the right equation is in the mix. And so it's a hybrid tends to be more of the, at least where I've been historically, tends to be a good inclusion in that process.
No, it's definitely good, because actually one kind of interesting, just made me think about it, conversation with younger programmers is that they don't understand, like, let's say C++ and Java as well. So a lot of organizations, like some of the nuances when you're coding some of these softwares or web pages, you need those skill sets, and they don't really have it because they don't teach it, because the future is Python and R and Node and all these newer languages. But then the problem in the real life practical, like, okay, we need to deploy this project, is that the base of a lot of these things are still older skill sets, that haven't gone away, that are still there.
So I will tell you one opportunity I was in. I was at Wachovia back at Y2K. I was there over New Year's Eve to New Year's, and there were COBOL programmers sitting at the screens waiting for things to fail. And to your point, it was people that had to be brought back into the fold, because although we were migrating towards a different direction, COBOL was still the foundational component, but we didn't have a lot of COBOL programmers. But if those programs had failed on Y2K, they were going to have folks sitting there ready to correct them. We went through Y2K, we celebrated New Year, and I went home the next morning and everything was good, but the preparation for it was tremendous. It really was a large opportunity. But it's a good point you bring up, that the evolution that has occurred has even changed things well beyond that. But if I go back and just give you one fun example of it, that was one back in the day, 23 years ago, where we had to have a very similar type of thought process.
You might find this one funny, but a client came to us recently and asked for a Citrix developer, a little bit of a red flag.
Yeah, they probably need to advance a little bit beyond where they are today, but at least they're open-minded, I guess, hopefully. But no, so
ironic part is that's a pretty cutting edge large company here in the Bay Area that gave me, I was like, whoa, okay, hey there. So I apologize.
No,
I
you're
cut
fine.
you off.
No, we can keep going through.
Oh yeah, no, I was that was just my little, when you said that made me think of the Citrix one, popped into my head.
Yeah, so realistically, as we look forward, and not wrapping up here, but from a just overall future standpoint, I've been reading about artificial intelligence, the Chat GPT, and some of the other factors that are coming into play now. And I find it to be very interesting because, what you read says that will eliminate the need for resources, and it will just become a standalone type process. And ultimately, if you look at the advancement of where we started a long time ago to where we are today, there has been a lot of advancement. But I'm hoping people aren't thinking that there's never going to be the need for resources, because critical resources are always going to be fundamental in every organization, no matter where you are. I don't think many, if any, will ever go to a strictly artificial intelligence type model. Anything's possible, but I think there's always going to be a resource need for strong talent with diverse backgrounds and open-mindedness and the willingness to really expand beyond what their focus areas are. And that's really what I always try to educate and coach my team on, and help them grow and evolve into areas outside of where they come in. I'm not the type of person that says, I want to go hire 10 people and they're going to be working for me 20 years from now. If I go hire 10 people, I want to see them actually grow and advance. And I joke with some of them, but some of the folks that I've hired throughout my career have moved up well beyond where I am in my career. And I love that aspect of it. And I do call them sometimes and joke with them that, I'll be happy to come and, work in your cafeteria or whatever. And I'm just joking with them. But to a certain degree, I've seen people advance, and I don't take all the credit for that because it's inherent in what they bring to the table. But I try to light the light bulb or the fire inside of them to not be satisfied to stay where they are and just ingrain themselves there for decades, especially if they have the ability to grow. And so, one of my goals is always talent growth, talent evolution. And so, when I say that, that's not necessarily trying to figure out the operation side of the component. There's so many factors when you're a leader. You have to look at the team. You have to look at the operations. You have to look at the business counterparts. You have to look at the executives in the mix. And so as you bring all that together, you can't discount any part of that. But I do see the team members get discounted a lot in equations for certain leadership. And I try to make sure that I never let that become part of what I fall into, because I value the team as much as anything else I just mentioned, because without that team, it's really not going to matter if the other counterparts exist. And so that's just from a leadership standpoint. I will say this, I've had some outstanding leaders take me under their wing and treat me as a mentee coming up through my career. And I give them all the credit in the world. I would not be where I am today if I had not had leadership bring me into the fold, because I was just a kid coming out of college back in the day. And a lot of it, all of us are, but I had early days, some really long-term career driven people that had the knowledge, but they had the leadership style that melded with what I wanted to be. And so I've tried to emulate them throughout my career. A lot of them are retired and other things have happened, unfortunately, but I did have the blessing of having a lot of really good leadership fold me into what I became today. And so I give them all the credit in the world. It's not me by any stretch.
I think that's kind of actually an important factor, because here in the Bay Area, maybe we get that's of course important in any business, but I feel like in the Bay Area, we have like maybe a go it alone culture, or like, oh, just figure it out as you move along kind of thing. And I think people discount that. Like my family's from Ohio originally, Ohio. So it's like that sort of older business culture in a way can be helpful, because you actually do get people that work in maybe like a longer term vision. You know, you're going to be with this company 5 years. We want to develop you, you know, where I feel like Bay Area, everything's like, go, 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 go. Okay, you're in your role 6 months. Okay, move on to the next role. Like it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter about the team. And I find that's the nice thing actually sometimes about working for Robert Half. They've been around since 1948. So they have that little bit of an older style business culture, more centered around development. And even I was a good, let's say, been in client facing roles and I was really good, but I've been brought into a team where you have people that have 30 years of experience that are just, you know, telling a 25-year-old, 26-year-old what I don't know, because you don't know what you don't know, as the saying goes.
And I think like, so I was going to say, Blake, one thing I would say is hybrid and remote has been a unique dynamic over the past 3 years. But what I would beg leadership to do is don't interact with your counterparts, whether that be team members or people that you're leading or whatever. I've seen back when I've been in person with a lot of team members, we had weekly one-on-ones, we had team meetings weekly, we had quarterly large meetings, we had everything we needed to have. We tried to stay interactive with one another. And I've seen a lot of that, and I've heard it from team members from other organizations and other places where some of that interaction has fallen by the wayside. And to your point, people are kind of left standing alone. They're still accomplishing things, but they don't feel engaged or feel part of the team any longer. So I guess one thing I would beg people to do, if you're a leader within an organization, is no matter whether you're with them in person or not, talk to them daily if you need to, but talk to them weekly at a minimum, one-on-one. Talk to the whole team weekly. Make sure everybody has a strong understanding of where the company's headed, where the team is headed, what the deliverables are, what issues exist, what do you need to be considering as an opportunity for improvement. All of those factors come into play. But when leaders distance themselves from the team, then it's hard to keep the team engaged and want to be a part of the organization as well. And I've seen that a lot wherever, no matter where I've been as well. And so, I think that's a good leadership mandate that we should have, is folks should absolutely maintain their interaction with all of the counterparts that you would maintain it with if you were sitting in an office every day. And if you're in an office every day and you're not doing it, implement it there as well, because if you could do it in person, it's even better. So just make sure that you're interacting with folks as actively as you can, because those personal relationships will drive you further down the road than any non-personal relationship that you have with individuals.
No, I'm actually in complete agreement, because I feel like, at least in my generation of people that, I'm 26 and I finished college when I was 23, and going into the workforce, like, there was this remote, like COVID happened, you had all this stuff going on. I was working remote for a long time. Even when I started at Robert Half, the pandemic was still going on. So it was like, you're kind of in the ether, I call it, because you're just sort of floating around on the internet space. And then they started at first when they're like, yeah, we want hybrid. I was like, oh, I don't need hybrid. I love working at home. And then when I started going in and working with people and kind of working under people that had a lot of experience, it made me go like, oh, wow, okay. And it started to like unlock it made me actually more creative. And I've definitely noticed a shift that I would say to some of the younger listeners that, like, honestly, it does help when you're in the office. As long as you have a good team, right, a good, leadership team, you will learn a lot. you'll learn a lot more than sitting on your computer by yourself. And I feel like, again, going back to our Silicon Valley mentality, is we have a bunch of programmers sit at home, they work 20 hours a week, and then they go, I don't know, play pickleball or surf or something. Like, you do lose a little bit of that I feel like when you get to the higher end of your career, or you're in like a more leadership position, that you can't play those games anymore. Those games don't work.
Yeah,
I should say. In
one
sales,
thing I was thinking, like, is when you're thinking
go for it.
about what happens in those conversations, it's not necessarily you coming and telling me what to accomplish. It's us grabbing a coffee and I'm like, tell me how your weekend was. Or let's have a little personal interaction, because what I found throughout my career and what has disappeared over the last 3 years is the ability to maintain that personal interaction where you're not wanting to delve into everybody's personal life, but to a certain degree, a little bit that you understand about somebody personally helps you develop a friendship and a teamwork and a partnership with them to deliver and execute together. Because you may tell me over the weekend, I took my dog for a walk, and I'm like, oh, I have a dog too. And then different aspects form together that don't necessarily form if you're remote from one another 100% of the time. So, as much as it may not be happening today, or it depends on the industry or where you're located, but coffees in the morning, lunchtime meetings, even after hours sessions, if you have the opportunity to have that personal interaction, is really invaluable, in my opinion. And young folks, some folks, I won't even say young, but some folks may not have that experience, or some folks may not want to do that. But I will tell you that there's a great opportunity to learn and grow from your teammates, your leadership, and other components as you're starting to bring that together. So I would be a big proponent of that. And I look forward to wherever I land next time, that it will have some in-person opportunities, and I'll have the opportunity to engage in conversations and coffee and lunch, or whatever the case is.
Oh, absolutely. And I feel like the kind of, you need those interactions, because when people are just working remotely, especially if you're new into an organization, you don't know everyone super well, and you're just doing everything remote, you can have really bad miscommunications, or somebody just decides, if somebody, let's say they don't decide to respond to their Slack, and if you're at least hybrid 2 days a week or something, you can walk over to their office or their side of the office and be like, hey, so what's going on? Like I needed help with this, that, or the other. And I've just noticed some things that would never happen in a real life setting occurring in remote settings in, different organizations I've been in. So the business culture too, I think, has changed. So like Robert Half in the past used to have I just call it like a 1980s bro culture where, stereotypical, like hit the phones, dial, dial, dial. And that was before my time. But all these people that worked there in the 2000s, the 90s, they're instantly like, oh shit, I don't want to. Their brain goes to a really negative place. And I think business culture in general has shifted here in the US, where it's like, it's not just about what you produce. It's about, it's getting more holistic in a more positive way. Like, how do you derive value for your life, for the people you work with, and do something generally positive in the overall scheme of things? And I think younger people maybe don't feel that way, but if you are in the right organization, you will. Maybe you've had a bad experience. I think what Jeff's talking about makes a lot of sense.
Well, and if you think about real quick, just the growth, like you said, you go back to the 80s and 90s, the way things were sold to you from an external standpoint, software providers back in the day were coming at things from a very different perspective. And now that whole perspective has changed on how you acquire and how you maintain those relationships. And I find the relationships with external providers of service, as well as providers of software and other counterparts, are actually much more friendly, I'll say, in this day and age. Not to say they weren't friendly before, but to your point, there was a driver of sales. They're still going to make the sales, but they found that the relationships help them grow their sales quicker than coming in and mandating certain things. And so I've seen a vast difference in that counterpart as well. So providers of service, providers of software, providers of all of those aspects are different than what they were. And so you bring up a good point there, that everybody's business model has evolved and changed. That no matter where you are, it's not what it was, and it never will be again. And it may not be where it is today, but that's okay as well. The evolution's going in a positive direction for sure.
And I think that's gonna definitely influence, hopefully here in the Bay, because like I don't know, it's weird for me sometimes, like even with clients or with coworkers, you know, you'll have miscommunications that would never occur in like those real life settings, and we're actually kind of moving more into like an in-person business model just in general right now. And it's actually been pretty cool because at least we have a bunch of offices throughout the Bay Area, and like we're like, oh, let's all go work here and then we'll go get lunch that day. And I think that's a does just makes it more real,
Definitely.
you know, because I can sit in my apartment all day long and look at this same wall and that wall and talk on my phone, but it's just not the same
Agree,
thing. It's
agree.
not the same.
You know, if I had to say one
Yeah.
thing about Silicon Valley Bank, it is a very great institution. It has a number of great talent. And so, for anyone that is listening that has an interest, as that talent becomes available, you've got a lot of talent to choose from. But I would say Silicon Valley Bank
Yeah.
has a wealth of very deep, knowledgeable, diversified talent. And so, I won't toot the horn too loud, but I'm very proud of everyone that's worked there. I would love to see them all be
Mhm.
successful and move to the next phase of their career as their door opens. I know they still have a little bit of window there inside of the organization, and there's still some future changes potentially that could come to Silicon Valley Bank. But if they're out there looking, you know, I can give a lot of them thumbs up and credit where, you know, I would definitely give them a
Yep.
positive if they're looking. So I just want to make sure that, you know, folks understand that, you know, each of these organizations has great talent that's putting them back out there in the market. And however they choose to supply for that, definitely, you know, look openly at all the different organizations.
Absolutely. And I would say right now, maybe there's a little bit of a stigma against, you know, SVB and different, you know, people from different banks. But at the same time, I think if we rewound the clock 1 year, everyone would be looking at SVB and as the super geniuses.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone there is, you know, the best, and that talent didn't go away. They are still some of the best in the
Yes.
industry. There's a reason that they were at the level they were, and they were hit mostly, if you step back from a financial standpoint, mostly hit by external factors that were out of their control. So I think that's important to note, and that's kind of why, you know, Jeff and I are talking today. And yeah, you know, anyone in Jeff's network as well, if you are looking for a new opportunity, me and my team would be glad to assist where we can. There's a lot of very talented people that we might be in this little bumpy water right now, but it's going to smooth out and it's going to go back. You know, and there's going to be new opportunities, maybe better than you even had before. So kind of keep your head up and just keep trying to get out there and get yourself in front of
Agree,
people.
agree, Blake. I couldn't say it better. And thank you for the words of encouragement to a lot of folks that may feel in a different position right now. But I think the words of encouragement are very good. And, you know, anything that I can do to, again, help anyone in any particular situation, I'm happy to do as well. I don't look at it as I'm a Superman on any standpoint to help people, but where I can make connections or anything can happen, please let me know. And I'm happy to help anyone find success and find expansion of their career as well.
Perfect. And I know that you kind of delved into the little this, but just as a nice little wrap up, where do you see yourself going in this next stage of your career, and maybe different industries that you'd be open to? I know it sounded like you were very open, but if there's anything to our listeners that is a little bit more targeted that might pull their
Yeah,
ear
I
a
mean,
little.
I honestly, I've looked at nonprofits, I've looked at insurance companies, I've looked at large scale manufacturing companies, I've looked at other financial institutions as well. So, like I said early on, I've been very broad in what I've looked for. I've looked more for position and not really looked at who the company is or what the industry is. I've looked more for, is there a place where, and I'll just call it operations, although that may not be a legitimate term anymore, but is there a place where operations can come in and help provide transformation? Because transformation really seems to be a driver for most large institutions, regardless of their footprint today, where they're trying to figure out where do they go next in their next phase of their advancement of their organization. And so
Mm.
for those that are looking for transformation, since I've sat between the business and technology, delivered, execute, and supported successfully and upgraded and all the different components that come into play, as well as executive interaction and team leadership, you know, I'd really love to land in a place where I can help transform a company into the next level and take them through the next couple of generations of their advancements. So that's kind of where I find I'm not particular to the industry as much as I am the opportunity to help someone achieve ultimate success in what they're trying to accomplish.
Oh, that's perfect. I mean, general is good.
I figure I'll be open. I'm very open-minded this iteration, very open-minded.
That's good. But, thank you for taking the time out this morning, Jeff, to talk. And yeah, I'm going to make sure we get this one up on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, LinkedIn, anyone in Jeff's network, just throw him a little lifeline, hit share, maybe like it below so other people can see him and, his thoughts on everything.
Thank you, Blake. I appreciate you. I appreciate you doing this. It means a lot to a lot of folks right now that are in a different phase of life. And I hope, to your point, everyone can take something away from this as a positive, and feel free to utilize it however you see fit.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you very much, and
hey, Blake,
have a great day.
If you need anything, let me know. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye, dude.
Bye-bye.